running prescription, and ASR, anaerobic speed reserve, and MAS, maximal aerobic speed. So I'll be discussing the pros of both different training methods for team sport athletes, as well as the cons and my beliefs as I've implemented both in Australian rules football on how I implement it and why I think it's important having a bit of both methods in your weekly structure, particularly over pre-season. So we'll get straight into it and then hang around for the end of the show where I'll promote a podcast episode that I've really enjoyed during the week. That's from another podcast, something new that I've been doing over the last few weeks, as well as upcoming guests, announcing the upcoming guests for the Propeller Pro live chat show. Remember, I'm catching up, for those listening in live, catching up with David Joyce in under an hour, in 30 minutes time, 3 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, to talk about performance mindset. So if you're interested in working on your mindset, whether you're a coach or an athlete, make sure to tune in then. And if you've got any questions, use the chat box. And I'll do my best to fit in your questions into the run sheet. I've also got Cullen Ball, the head physiotherapist at Sydney Wanderers. That will be tomorrow at 4 p.m. So that's on Friday. So if you missed the chat with David Joyce, you can tune in for a live chat tomorrow. But let's get straight into it. So pros for tempo prescription. So what is tempo running? That's just simply running for distances typically. So you'll be doing your intervals like 200-meter efforts, 150-meter efforts, 300s, 400s, 100s, 80s, 60s, and potentially 40-meter efforts. So you're prescribing the distance, you're giving the athlete the times to hit it. If you're going for more an aerobic benefit, typically it'll be moving at under 5 meters per second for male athletes. And so you're not getting high speed running, you're not getting sprint distance, and your work to rest ratio is either 1-to-1 or there's some active recovery with it. So you might do an effort of 100 meters at, let's say, 20 seconds, and then you have a 20-second jog, and then 10 seconds rest before your next rep. Whereas you can also prescribe for high speed running. So you get the athlete to run a 17-second rep, and that will get them around 50 meters of high speed running for the rep, and they might have a passive rest of 20 seconds or 23 seconds. So on the 40 they're going. So they're getting a little bit more rest for their work because you're raising the intensity. And same if you want to getting sprint distance, you might get them doing some repeat 50-meter reps at a prescribed time to ensure that they're getting above 7 meters per second to get your sprint distance. So depending on what you're trying to get, you've got your running GPS targets in mind on how you're conditioning the athlete, and what the theme of that conditioning program is, or what they've got from their football program in that training session. And then you're adjusting your distance to understand what volume you're going to get and how many reps to do in that set. And you're giving them the target for time on that will manipulate the different bands that you're getting in terms of running speeds. Pros of tempo running. So for one, when you're managing a large group, 40 to 60 athletes at times, the simplicity is helpful. So when you're setting up your session, it's really simple to obviously set up around the oval or through the middle if you're doing more speed efforts, your distance targets, and it's a one in, all in. So whatever you're getting your athletes to do, or you might manipulate it if you break them up into groups, depending on their fitness levels, which would be leaning a little bit on the MAS method, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you're getting them all to run 150s, you might just break them up into 3 running groups: your fast guys, your middle group, and then your least quickest at the end. And they've just got different times that you're trying to get them to aim for, or you're manipulating the rest periods. So that could be one pro of tempo-based prescription, is it's very simple to not only plan for and facilitate the session, but also to work out the volume you're going to get from it. It's inclusive, so coaches will like it because the athletes are running together. They're all running at the same distance, obviously just getting different times, but you may find that one of the pros of tempo running is that if an athlete's having a really good day on that particular day, they can compete and actually run with the stronger athletes in that group and get the same targets. Whereas with MAS, it's more rigid because it's different. You're running to different distances depending on the group that you're in from your testing. So that inclusive nature of it allows athletes to compete, which has its pros because they can push themselves and challenge themselves with the best. So they're training with the better runners, which coaches always like. From a philosophy point of view, tempo works quite well in that sense. And it's not dependent on testing. So you don't need to either estimate what their 2K time trial is. If you haven't done a 2K time trial, you can get straight into it with tempo-based prescription by just prescribing what volumes you want them to get out of it from those running speeds, as I mentioned. So you don't need to wait for a test to get into tempo running. So that's another pro. Cons, it's not objective, and you're probably not getting it as consistent of a training stimulus as you are with MAS prescription. So what I mean by that is typically when we're doing tempo running, let's say you do repeat 150s and you're getting the group to run those in 25-second reps. For some, that's nearly an all-out sprint, and that for others, that's a relatively still a hard effort, but it might be pretty cruisy for them, especially if they're going on the minute. They're well recovered. So you're not individualizing it to that athlete's physical profile. So typically, tempo running will challenge the middle athletes. It will be too hard for the less fit or not as fast athletes, depending on the program you're doing for the day. And it won't be challenging enough for your best athletes. For them, it'll be within their comfort zone. So your middle athletes will adapt and get some good progress. Your weaker, less fit athletes are potentially at risk for injury as they're constantly pushing above their threshold. And then your superior athletes potentially won't get the same benefits or may even get some detraining effects compared to if they were doing a individualized prescribed running prescription like MAS or anaerobic speed reserve. So they're the main two cons. So not objective, and that it's inconsistent, the stimulus that you're going to get. Moving over to MAS and ASR. So maximal aerobic speed is simply something that you can use by doing a minimum of a 6-minute test. That seems to be the standard for what the research tells us that compares with working out your as a maximal test. So you run 6 minutes, run as far as you can, or for most footballers, that would be a 2K time trial for male athletes because they'll get between that 6 and 7 minutes or 6 to 8 minutes, depending on what level you're at. So that can cover for junior athletes, female athletes, or a group of athletes that you think that 2K is too long, i.e. the test will go potentially up to 10 minutes or above 8, then just go with a 6-minute run as far as you can. And then from there, you can work out the distance they got and just divide that by the time. So if they ran 1,400 meters, divide that by 360 to work out the average speed that the athlete was moving at. And that's their MAS time. So just think of it exactly the same as for those that have done strength training. Typically, we do percentage-based lifting. So if you've been on our program, that's something you'd be familiar with, where we work, the team builder works out what your 1 rep max is from the numbers that you've entered in the app. So let's say you did 5 reps at 80 kilos, it'll estimate that your 1 rep max is around 90 kilos. And then when we prescribe percentages to lift at 70% of your 1 rep max, it will give you a guide on what weight you should hit on the bar for the stimulus that the coach has prescribed to get. So if we're working on max strength, we'll be doing higher intensities, i.e. lifting heavy, 70, 75, 80% typically of your 1 rep max. No different with MAS programming. So we've got your average speed that you're moving at, that is your aerobic capacity. So for some, that might be 5 meters per second. And when we're prescribing aerobic day, you might be doing 40 seconds at 110% of your MAS. So you're moving at 5.5 meters per second for your MAS. So you'll work out for the 40 seconds, times that by 5.5 to give us a distance that we're trying to hit on that. So hopefully that makes sense. The anaerobic speed reserve, we find out your MAS from your time trial, the fitness test, and then either if you're wearing GPS or you do a flying 40 meter, we work out your max velocity, so how fast you can move. So let's say your MAS is 5 meters per second. Your max velocity, the fastest that GPS is tracked, is 9 meters per second. Your anaerobic speed reserve is the number between those two. So for that athlete, it would be 4 meters per second. And that just gives us an idea of how to prescribe for your repeat speed efforts. So for some, when we're doing those high intensity efforts, MAS is not enough because obviously that's an aerobic dominant test for doing your MAS testing. So for those that are more geared and their athlete profile is more geared to longer distance running, MAS works really well for those interval based days. Whereas when we're working on your repeat speed, we want to be using your max velocity and your MAS to determine what we should prescribe for your shorter distance, high speed efforts. So rather than going off just the max velocity, we're going to go off your anaerobic speed reserve. We'll do, let's say we're running at 100, so it would be 30% of your ASR. So that would be on top of your MAS running. So let's say your MAS is 5 meters per second, then we would plus 30% of your anaerobic speed reserve. So for this athlete is 4 meters per second. And then that will give us a target for, and you might be using 15-second reps for your super maximal work, 12 seconds, 10 seconds. If we're working on anaerobic work, more that lactate threshold work, we could be going up to 40 seconds, 35, 30 seconds. So more of those challenging not only your repeat speed, but also your ability to recover from high intensity efforts as well. Typically, we won't do the active recovery stuff with that type of training, but we would respect the rest period. So you might be doing, for a 40-second rep, you could be getting up to 80 seconds rest to allow your body to recover. For those more fast hits, so for those with really high ASRs, they're going to handle really well the repeat speed days. For those with a really high MAS but a low ASR, they're going to handle well with our longer interval days. So your more 3-minute max effort days. But your high ASR guys are going to struggle with those longer 3-minute max efforts. So they're going to be able to recover from them as well. They're going to be more stressful on the system. So it allows you to be able to group athletes together, program not only running distances, so you can have cones. So if everyone's running 15 seconds, you'll have different cones for different groups depending on their ASR. But also you may have different recovery periods. Some are resting passively, some are resting with an active recovery, or some might just be having a shorter rest period, so you can manipulate that. Just got a question in there. Central West Rehab, had any luck using the ratio of MAS to maximal sprint speed to divide the group physiological groups? Yep. So yeah, absolutely. So you can use that ratio to work out whether your aerobic guys that have a low max speed, they'll be in one group. You might have a couple that are sort of your hybrid group, one that's more aerobic dominant, one that's more speed dominant. And then you'd have your fast twitch guys, those with really high anaerobic speed reserves. So yeah, for those that aren't aware of that physiological work, I can't remember the research on who's done it. It was done I think first in cricket, or that was certainly first where I heard it. And that's something that you can definitely do to be able to work out those groups. And I would advise doing that. It's quite effective and something that I've done before. And so you'd have up to 4 groups. And that's something you're taking into account when you're planning your sessions on manipulating how many reps the aerobic group's doing, what's the rest periods, particularly for the speed group, and then how you're challenging the hybrid. And those hybrid groups, sometimes you might move them more to be flexible with it. So you might move them depending on how they're feeling that day. You might challenge them, and the ones that are more speed dominant actually run with the speed group, and they change groups that day. Or conversely, those that are more aerobic dominant, you move them with the aerobic athletes to run on their targets, so they're getting more challenge from a heart rate point of view, conditioning point of view, for physiological point of view. So yeah, simply put, you just work out what's their MAS, and then divide it with their maximal sprint speed to work out what their ratio is, and then that will determine. So typically, it's your lower guys with lower sprint speed will be more aerobic, and those with a higher ratio will be your more speed-based athletes. It can range from anywhere from around 1.4 to 2. So, for example of that, someone that's 2 might have a MAS of 5, and their maximal sprint is 10 for how fast they can move, as an example. Or probably more realistic, their MAS is 4 and their maximal sprint speed is 8 meters per second. Okay, so the cons, so in terms of pros, whole group is being equally challenged, so the adaptation is more consistent. And great question as well from Central West Hab. Thanks for that from Rehab. So yeah, whole group is being equally challenged because you're breaking them up into groups. You're working off their testing time trial, just like we do in the gym from an aerobic point of view. But you're also taking into account how glycolytic they are with their maximal sprint speed. So it's a little bit more calculated. It's more objective and individualized. So you take it, probably the best way to individualize for a large group. And practical as well. You don't need a big scientific lab to work out their VO2 max. You just need to do a 6-minute aerobic test and a sprint. So it's practical. From a planning point of view, it's more predictable on the physiological strain that you're putting on the athlete. So you can have themes to your sessions. So if you know the football program is going to be quite demanding from a small-sided games point of view, you might have more of an aerobic sort of stimulus day on that day, or that might be maybe a day where you focus on sharpening your weapon. So work on your strengths, because they're going to be both psychologically more favorable for those athletes, but also physically their body's going to be able to do more of that type of work. So for the day that the football program is quite demanding, you might work on the athlete's strengths, and then when the football program is not as demanding, you might work on more their topping up their weaknesses for one day, and that might be with tempo prescription. So there's a bit of a balanced approach to it. And the fact that you get to more accurately bucket athletes in with that ratio that I just talked about before, using their MAS and their maximal sprinting speed, max velocity. The cons, it's less engaging at times for the athletes. It's quite rigid because you're told how far you can run in that time. So there's no opportunity, unless the coach bumps you up a group, there's no opportunity to compete with the best athletes because they're in their own group. That can be both from a philosophical point of view. The coaches may perceive that as why the less fit athletes running less distance than the fittest athletes. We want those, less fit athletes being challenged and training with the best athletes so they can improve, which works with things like kicking, skill acquisition. But from a physiological point of view, we know that has its risk, because although yes, you're getting a strong stimulus over time, over a long pre-season, it's high risk. So working within an athlete's means, especially if they're a younger athlete, to allow them to develop within their thresholds is probably the best way to go from an objective point of view. Coaches may, as I mentioned, coaches may perceive it as less, as a bit of a cop-out. And it does rely on accurate testing. So if an athlete has a really poor day with their 2K total, or maybe they've never done one before, a 6-minute test, or if you've got no GPS and you're getting them to do a flying 20 and estimating their max speed, so it's not as reliable, then you're potentially prescribing running times that actually aren't that accurate to the athlete. So the fact that it does rely on testing, even though it's practical tests, can have its issues. The weather's really bad on the day that you test, is another example. So the reliance on testing can be a problem. So hopefully that helps. From a programming point of view, just like my stance with a lot of things when it comes to methods, is Olympic lifting effective, or should you just do loaded jumps? Why not do a bit of both? And I think my take on this is the same. Over the years, I've done a lot more tempo prescription, but with the latest research and the work by guys like Nathan Heaney, I'm reading through his articles and the great work he's doing with the conditioning consultant, which I'd recommend checking out, as well as other colleagues and other like that research, which I'll try and find where the paper is. I think it was Phil Cole's a cricket guy, conditioning coach working in cricket, bucketing those groups using the ratio. So there's been some good momentum behind it over the last few years, and it's something that I've grown towards and feel like having that objective measure, it almost makes a lot more sense in the way we want to do things. Whereas with tempo running, you're sort of leaving a lot to chance. So I think there's a place for a bit of both. You want athletes at times to be able to prove themselves and have that inclusive approach with tempo running, and have those days where it's simple for the athletes. They're used to it. They know what they're getting, and they're challenging themselves all in one. But then on the other days, and probably spend majority of your time in preseason where it's prescribed, and that's specific to you and your running capacity. So hopefully that helps shed a little bit of light. If you have any further up questions, make sure to hit us up. In terms of the podcast this week, I've got Claudio Altieri on Tuesday, but he's just moved over to the States. So we're just going to confirm that time. I'll update it on our Instagram when we lock in the time, but make sure to tune in for that one. That'll be next week, day to be confirmed. Carmen Coloma, our interview with her, that will be released, as well as Steve Saunders on Wednesday. And then Friday, JB Marin, the bite-size episode will be released. So, massive week. Claudio Altieri for our live episode, Steve Saunders for our weekly interview on the podcast, and then JB Marin for our bite-size. And in terms of the podcast that I'd like to shout out to today, it's the video creators. I've been following their podcast for some time now and really enjoyed their recent episode on ways to connect with your audience immediately using the YouTube community tab. And they gave some great practical tips. So make sure to check out the Video Creators podcast on Spotify, especially for those looking to use YouTube as a form of educating and connecting with their community. Maybe you're running a business. So check that out. And for all those listening in, and particularly for a lot of AFLW athletes that have been joining our program recently, I know you've got a long off season and you're looking to get into work. So if you're interested in joining our program and following a more objective way of doing your conditioning, like using your MAS and anaerobic speed reserve, it's as simple as in our program, you can join it for a 2-week trial. All I get you to do is do a 6-minute test and I can work out your MAS. And then if you've got GPS data, then we can work out your max velocity for your anaerobic speed reserve, and you get a feel for that program. So I know you've got a longer off season. For the guys that also maybe in rehab or just want to get some extra work and get ready into an in-season strength and power program, maybe conditioning is not your focus, but strength and power is, head over to our website, predatorpro.com, join the 2-week trial, and you'll have no regrets. Results will be coming. Thanks, guys. I'll see you on the next episode.